"It's
It
too
doesn't have to
big,
be
I
this way,
can't."
Cowboy.
The lonely cowboy
You just need
panicked.
to trust me.
His giant bride said, "It's not big that much." The summer of 1874 burned across the Arizona Territory like a branding iron pressed against leather. Dust Vale wasn't much of a town, just a crooked main street flanked by weathered buildings that seemed to lean away from the relentless sun. The church bell hadn't rung in months. The saloon stayed open all hours, and the law was whatever Sheriff Pruitt said it was on any given day. Elias Boone rode into town on a Tuesday afternoon with nothing but a worn saddle, a tired horse named Whisper, and a heart that had turned to stone 3 years prior. At 36, he looked older, lines carved deep around his gray eyes, his hair bleached nearly white from years under an unforgiving sky. He'd lost Catherine to a gang of outlaws outside of Santa Fe, watched her die in his arms while their cabin burned. Since then, he'd been drifting, taking odd jobs, sleeping under stars that no longer offered comfort. The marketplace was sparse. A few vendors selling dried goods, leatherwork, and questionable meat. Elias planned to sell his old saddle for whatever coin he could get and move on by sundown. That's what he always did. Never stayed long enough for names to stick or for anyone to ask questions about the haunted look in his eyes. But then he heard the laughter. It wasn't the good-natured kind. It was cruel, sharp-edged, the sound of people finding entertainment in someone else's misery. A group of 5 men circled a market stall, their voices carrying across the dusty square. "Christ almighty, look at the size of her! My barn ain't that big. Who'd be fool enough to marry that? Man would need a ladder just to kiss her good night." The laughter rolled like thunder. Elias found himself drawn toward the commotion despite his better judgment. He'd learned long ago that other people's troubles were best left alone. But something pulled him forward. In the center of the circle stood a woman unlike any Elias had ever seen. She towered above the men mocking her, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Her shoulders were broad, her frame powerful. Dressed in a simple cotton dress that someone had clearly sewn by hand to fit her extraordinary proportions. Her hair, dark as crow feathers, was pulled back in a thick braid. But what struck Elias most weren't her dimensions. It was her face. She kept her eyes downcast, hands folded in front of her as if trying to make herself smaller, a gentle smile fixed on her lips despite the cruelty surrounding her. "Come on, Mara," one of the men jeered. "Surely someone out there wants a wife who can pull a plow without a mule." The woman, Mara, maintained her composure, though Elias could see her knuckles whiten as she gripped her hands tighter. On her stall sat jars of golden honey, wild flowers pressed in paper, and small carved wooden animals that showed surprising delicacy. "Gentlemen," she said softly, her voice deeper than most women's but melodic, "the honey is fresh. Would any of you like to purchase some?" This only brought more laughter. One man, emboldened by whiskey and the crowd, reached out and knocked over several jars. They shattered on the ground, honey pooling in the dust like liquid gold bleeding out. Mara's face finally broke, just for a moment, a flash of pain crossing her features before she schooled it back to neutrality. Elias felt something crack inside his chest, some calcified piece of his heart shifting. He found himself stepping forward. "Those jars," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "How much for all of them?" The men turned. The ringleader, a thick-necked ranch hand named Buck Morrison, sneered. "Well, well, fresh meat in town. You got a giantess fetish, stranger?" Elias ignored him, keeping his eyes on Mara. She looked up now, surprise evident on her face. Up close, he could see she had green eyes. Not just green, but the color of new leaves in spring, bright and alive despite the sadness they held. "How much?" he repeated. You want to buy the honey?" Her voice carried disbelief. "All of it, whatever you have." "That'll be $12, she said hesitantly. It was more than he had, but Elias pulled out what remained of his money, $8 and some change. "I'll take what this covers, and I'll pay double if someone helps this lady clean up the mess these gentlemen made." The emphasis on gentlemen was sharp enough to draw blood. Buck took a step forward, hand moving toward his hip, but something in Elias's eyes stopped him. They were the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose, and men like Buck, bullies who found strength in numbers, recognized that look. "Ain't worth it," Buck muttered, spitting in the dust. "Come on, boys, let's get a drink." The crowd dispersed, leaving Elias and Mara alone in the settling dust. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly knelt down. Even kneeling, she was nearly as tall as he was standing, and began picking up the broken glass. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know." Elias knelt beside her, careful of the glass. "But I wanted to." "Why?" It was a simple question, but Elias found he didn't have a simple answer. Why had he intervened? He'd passed by 100 injustices in his wandering. He'd learned to keep his head down, to not get involved. "Because," he finally said, "I know what it's like to be alone." Mara's hands stilled. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Elias felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two souls who understood loneliness in their bones. "Thank you," she whispered. They worked in silence, collecting the glass and salvaging what honey they could. When they finished, Mara packaged up several jars in brown paper and handed them to Elias. "I can't take all of these," he protested. "I only paid for—" "Please," she interrupted gently. "It's the least I can do." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elias realized he had nowhere to go. The rooming house was full, the saloon floor too crowded with drunks, and he'd spent most of his money on honey he didn't particularly need. As if reading his thoughts, Mara said, "There's a storm coming. I can see it in the way the light's sitting." She hesitated, then added, "I have a storage barn on the edge of town. It's not much, but it's dry. You're welcome to shelter there tonight." Pride made Elias want to refuse, but practicality and something else, something he didn't want to examine too closely, made him nod. "I'd appreciate that, ma'am." "Mara," she corrected with a small smile. "My name is Mara Weller." "Elias Boone." They shook hands. Her grip was strong enough to crush his fingers, but she was careful, gentle. Her hand engulfed his completely. As they walked toward the edge of town, whisper trailing behind, the wind began to pick up. Mara had been right about the storm. By the time they reached her barn, a sturdy structure that she clearly built herself, the first drops of rain were starting to fall, and the horizon flickered with distant lightning. Inside, the barn was surprisingly comfortable. One corner was set up as a living space with a cot, a small table, oil lamps, and shelves lined with books. More books than Elias had seen since leaving Santa Fe. The rest of the space held tools, lumber, and supplies. "You live here?" Elias asked. Mara nodded, moving to light a lamp. "The house in town was my parents'. After they passed 2 years ago, I sold it. Couldn't afford the upkeep, and she trailed off, but Elias understood what she wasn't saying. The people of Dust Vale hadn't made her feel welcome. "I'll set up near the door," Elias said, gesturing to the entrance. "Don't be foolish. The rain will blow in. There's space here." She indicated an area near her living corner, separated by a curtain hung on a rope. "I'll give you privacy." As the storm unleashed its fury outside, Mara heated water for tea on a small portable stove. She moved with surprising grace despite her size, and Elias found himself watching her, fascinated. She'd braided her hair up, revealing a long, elegant neck. Her hands, though large and work-roughened, moved with delicacy as she prepared the tea. They sat on opposite sides of the small table, cups warming their hands, listening to rain hammer the roof. The silence between them was comfortable, lacking the awkwardness Elias usually felt around other people. "You're not from here," Mara finally said. It wasn't a question. "No. Been drifting for 3 years now. Arizona, New Mexico, sometimes down into Mexico." "Running from something?" Elias's jaw tightened. "Running toward something, maybe. Haven't found it yet." Mara nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I've never left Dust Vale. Born here, grew up here. I keep thinking I should leave, find somewhere new where people don't know me, where I could start fresh." "Why don't you?" She smiled sadly. "Fear, I suppose. The devil you know." She gestured vaguely. "Besides, this is my parents' land. It's all I have left of them." "What happened to them?" "Cholera outbreak 4 years back. Took half the town. I was 18, already tall as a man. Got taller after they passed. Doctor said it was some kind of condition, bones that don't know when to stop growing." She said it matter-of-factly, but Elias heard the pain underneath. People were kind at first, but kindness has a short memory when you're different. Elias studied her face in the lamplight, the strong features, the sadness in her eyes, the way she held herself as if apologizing for taking up space. "I've been traveling across this territory for years," he said quietly. "Seen all manner of people, good, bad, cruel, kind. You know what I've learned?" She shook her head. "That the size of a person's body has nothing to do with the size of their soul. And most people are so busy being small inside that they can't see anything else." Mara's eyes glistened. That's a kind thing to say." "It's a true thing." They talked late into the night, voices low beneath the storm's roar. Mara told him about her love of books, how she'd taught herself carpentry from her father's manuals, how she kept bees and sold their honey, because it was one of the few trades where her size was actually helpful. She could reach the highest hives without a ladder. Elias found himself talking too, more than he had in years. He told her about Catherine, about the life they'd built and lost, about the emptiness that had followed him like a shadow. "Does it get easier?" Mara asked. "The loneliness?" Elias considered this. Before tonight, he would have said no, but sitting here, sharing tea and stories with this extraordinary woman, he felt something shift, a crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. "I don't know," he admitted, "but for the first time in a long while, I'd like to find out." When they finally settled in for sleep, separated by the curtain, Elias lay awake, listening to the storm gradually fade. Through a gap in the fabric, he could see Mara's shadow on the wall, larger than life, but somehow, in this moment, just right. "Elias?" Her voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes?" Thank you for today, for seeing me." He smiled in the dark. "Thank you for letting me stay." Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, and Elias Boone fell asleep without nightmares for the first time in 3 years. Morning arrived with sharp, clean sunlight that seemed to polish the world new. Elias woke to find Mara already up, brewing coffee over her small stove. The smell alone was enough to pull him from his bedroll. "Morning," she said, glancing over her shoulder. Her hair was still braided, but loosened slightly, a few dark strands framing her face. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here." "Neither was I," Elias admitted, accepting the cup she offered. The coffee was strong and good, better than anything he'd had in months. His plan had been to leave at first light, drift to the next town, the next temporary job, the next night under unfamiliar stars. That had been his pattern for 3 years. But as he sat there, drinking coffee and watching Mara move around her small living space, he found the urgency to leave had vanished. "I noticed your fence line is damaged," he said suddenly. "Western side, where it meets the main road. Storm probably didn't help." Mara looked surprised. "You noticed that?" "Old habit. My father was a rancher. Taught me to check fence lines first thing." He paused. "I could fix it, if you want. Pay for the hospitality. You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not, but I'd like to. Been a while since I did honest work for honest people." Something in Mara's expression softened. "I'd appreciate that. The lumber's stored in the back. Help yourself to whatever you need." What Elias thought might take a morning stretched into days. The fence was worse than he'd initially assessed, and once he started repairing it, he noticed other things. A loose board on the barn, a leak in the roof, hinges that needed oiling. Mara worked alongside him when she could, proving to be as capable with tools as she'd claimed. She could lift beams that would take 2 men to move, hold posts steady while Elias hammered, and her measurements were always precise. They fell into an easy rhythm, working through the heat of the day, breaking for simple meals, talking about everything and nothing. Elias learned that Mara had a sharp sense of humor, that she could quote entire passages from books she'd read years ago, that she hummed while she worked, old folk songs her mother had taught her. She learned that Elias had a scar on his left shoulder from a bull riding accident when he was 17, that he could play harmonica, but hadn't touched one since Catherine died, that he was better with animals than people, and could gentle even the most skittish horse. Whisper, his usually standoffish mare, had taken to Mara immediately. The horse would follow her around like a puppy, and Mara would sneak her apples and carrots, speaking to her in that gentle voice that seemed at odds with her imposing size. On the 4th day, they tackled the barn's main support beam. A crack had developed that Mara had been ignoring, hoping it would hold. But the storm had worsened it, and now the entire structure was at risk if they didn't replace it. "We'll need to lift the roof support temporarily," Elias said, studying the problem. "I'll rig a pulley system." "I can hold it," Mara said simply. "It's too heavy, even for you." She gave him a look that was half amused, half exasperated. "Elias, I've been managing this place alone for 2 years. I know my strength." She was right, of course. While Elias worked to position the new beam, Mara held the roof support, hundreds of pounds of lumber and weight, steady above her head. Her face reddened with effort, muscles standing out in her arms, but she didn't waver. "Almost got it," Elias muttered, struggling to maneuver the replacement beam into position. It was massive old-growth oak, that he'd found in her lumber pile. He tried to lever it up, but the angle was wrong. He pushed harder, felt his feet slip in the dirt. "It's too big, I can't." The words burst out of him, frustration and embarrassment mixing. From above him came a sound he'd rarely heard, Mara's laugh. Not the polite chuckle she sometimes gave, but a real laugh, full and rich. "It's not big that much," she said, her voice strained but amused. "Just needs 2 hearts instead of 1. Something about those words hit Elias like a physical blow. He looked up at her, this extraordinary woman holding up the sky, smiling down at him despite the strain, despite everything, and felt the last of his walls crumble. "You're right," he said softly. "Together, then." They adjusted their positions, with Mara stabilizing from above and Elias providing leverage from below. The beam slid into place with a satisfying thunk. Mara carefully lowered the roof support onto it, and they both stepped back, breathing hard. "Not bad for a couple of amateurs," Mara said, wiping sweat from her forehead. Elias looked at what they'd built together, the repaired fence, the fixed roof, the solid barn. Then he looked at Mara, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen in 3 years. Possibility. "Mara," he said, "I think I'd like to stay a while longer. In Dust Vale, I mean, if that's all right." Her eyes widened. "You'd stay?" "Not in your barn," he added quickly. "I wouldn't impose, but I could find work in town, maybe rent a room." "There's a cabin," she interrupted, "about half a mile east of here on my property line. It's been empty for years. Belonged to a prospector who left during the gold rush. It's small and needs work, but—" She trailed off, hope and fear warring in her expression. "I'd like to see it." The cabin was indeed small. 1 room, really, with a stone fireplace and walls that daylight showed through in places. But the bones were good, and Elias had rebuilt worse. "I could fix this up," he said, already mentally cataloging what he'd need. "Make it livable." "I could help," Mara offered. "And you wouldn't need to pay rent. The land just sits empty otherwise." They stood in the doorway together, and Elias became aware of how close they were standing, how he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, how his heart was beating faster than it had in years. "Why are you being so kind to me?" he asked quietly. Mara was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you're the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw a person. Not a curiosity, not a monster, not something to mock or pity, just me." Elias reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. It dwarfed his own, but her grip was gentle, trembling slightly. "I see you, Mara Weller," he said, "and what I see is the strongest person I've ever met. And I don't mean the way you can lift a roof beam." A tear rolled down her cheek. She made no move to wipe it away, just stood there holding his hand like it was something precious and fragile. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias Boone meant it. The weeks that followed brought a kind of contentment Elias had thought lost to him forever. He threw himself into rebuilding the cabin, and true to her word, Mara helped whenever she could. Together, they patched walls, replaced the roof, installed new windows that Mara had somehow acquired from a trader passing through. The town's reaction to Elias's continued presence was mixed. Some folks nodded approvingly, seeming to respect a man who did honest work. Others whispered behind their hands, speculating about the nature of his relationship with the giant woman. Buck Morrison and his friends made crude jokes at the saloon, but they'd learned to keep their distance after Elias had quietly but firmly broken Buck's nose when the man had gone too far with his comments about Mara. Elias didn't care what they thought. For the first time since Catherine's death, he woke each morning with purpose. He'd work on the cabin until midday, then head to Mara's property to help with whatever needed doing. They fell into comfortable routines. She'd make lunch, they'd work together through the afternoon heat, and in the evenings they'd sit on her porch and watch the sun set while talking about their days. It was during one of these evenings that Mara surprised him. "Would you like to learn about the bees?" she asked. The beehives were arranged on the eastern edge of her property, 10 white boxes that hummed with activity. Elias had watched her tend them from a distance, had marveled at how the bees seemed to recognize her, landing on her arms and shoulders without stinging. "They know their keeper," Mara explained, suiting him up in protective gear. "They can sense fear, but also calm. If you approach them with respect, they'll accept you." She moved among the hives with practiced ease, her large hands surprisingly delicate as she lifted frames dripping with golden honey. She showed Elias how to check for the queen, how to spot signs of disease, how to harvest without disrupting the colony's work. "My mother taught me this," she said softly. "It was our thing, just the two of us. Father never understood the appeal, but Mother said the bees taught patience. You can't rush them or force them. You have to work with their nature, not against it." Elias watched her face as she spoke, saw the softness there, the vulnerability. On impulse, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She froze, honey dripping forgotten from the frame in her hands. "Mara," he said quietly, "I need you to know what I feel for you." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice pained. "Please don't say it unless you mean it. I couldn't bear it if—" "I mean it," he said firmly. "I've been running from feelings for so long I forgot what they felt like. But this, it's real, Mara. You make me want to stop running." She set down the honey frame with shaking hands, removed her beekeeping veil. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm too much," she whispered. "Too big, too strange, too—" "Perfect," he interrupted. "You're perfect, Mara, not despite your size, not because of it. Just you, all of you." When they kissed for the first time, Mara had to bend down and Elias had to stretch up. And it should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. It was gentle and sweet, and tasted of honey and hope. As summer deepened into early fall, their relationship blossomed. Elias finished the cabin and moved in, but he spent most of his time at Mara's barn anyway. She taught him to cook, to garden, to find joy in simple things. He taught her to ride horses properly. Though no horse could truly carry her, she learned to work with them, to gentle them, to move in harmony with their nature. The town gradually accepted them as a fixture. Old Mrs. Henshaw at the general store started greeting Mara warmly. Father McCready, the priest, tipped his hat to them both on Sundays. Even Sheriff Pruitt, a gruff man of few words, mentioned that it was nice to see someone make an honest woman of Mara Weller. It was that comment that planted the seed in Elias's mind. He began saving money from odd jobs around town, repairing roofs, breaking horses, helping with harvests. He was careful about it, secretive. Mara noticed his frequent trips to town, but didn't pry, respecting his privacy as he respected hers. 3 months after that first kiss among the beehives, Elias took his savings to the traveling jeweler who passed through Dust Vale once a season. The man's eyes widened when Elias described what he wanted. "That's a substantial undertaking," the jeweler said carefully. "The band would need to be quite large. Can you do it?" The jeweler studied Elias for a long moment, then nodded. "Give me 3 weeks, but it won't be cheap." "I don't care about the cost." The weeks crawled by. Elias was terrible at keeping secrets, and Mara noticed his distraction. One evening, as they sat watching the stars emerge, she finally confronted him. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You've been different lately. Distant." Elias's heart hammered. This wasn't how he'd planned it. He'd wanted to wait for the ring, for the perfect moment. But looking at her face, seeing the worry there, he couldn't make her doubt his feelings for even one more day. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "Everything's right. That's what scares me." "I don't understand." He turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Mara Weller, you are the strongest, kindest, most extraordinary person I've ever known. You lifted me out of darkness I didn't even know I was drowning in. When I'm with you, I'm not running any more. I'm home." Tears were streaming down her face now. "Elias." "I don't have the ring yet," he continued, his own voice thick with emotion. "The jeweler's still making it. But I can't wait any more. I need you to know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" For a long moment, Mara just stared at him. Then she started to laugh, that full, joyous laugh that he'd come to love. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." She pulled him into her arms, lifting him clear off the ground as she had that first day with the roof beam. And Elias, who had spent 3 years feeling like he was falling through empty space, finally felt held. The engagement brought a shift in the town's atmosphere. While most people seemed genuinely happy for the couple, there were those who viewed it as an affront to natural order. Buck Morrison and his gang fell into the latter category, their jokes turning darker, more vicious. Elias ignored them. He'd dealt with men like Buck his whole life, small men who needed to make others smaller to feel big themselves. As long as they kept their distance from Mara, he could tolerate their existence. The ring arrived in mid-October, and it was perfect. A simple silver band with a small sapphire, sized to fit Mara's finger. Elias planned to present it to her at dinner, a modest celebration at the town's only restaurant that Father McCready had helped arrange. What he didn't know was that Buck Morrison had been drinking heavily that afternoon, working himself into a rage about that freak and her pet Cowboy getting ideas above their station. What he didn't know was that Buck had sent a telegram 3 weeks prior to someone from Elias's past, a man named Vic Keller, who had led the gang that killed Catherine. Elias had put a bullet in Vic's brother during that raid, had sworn vengeance against the whole gang before disappearing into his wandering. Vic had spent 3 years looking for him, and now, thanks to Buck's malice, he knew exactly where to find him. They rode into Dust Vale at sunset, 3 men on horseback, dust trailing behind them like a funeral shroud. Elias was walking Mara to dinner when he saw them, and his blood ran cold. "Mara," he said quietly, urgently, "go to the church, now." She heard the fear in his voice and followed his gaze. "Who are they?" "People from before. Please, just go." "Elias Boone!" Vic Keller's voice rang out across the street. He was a wiry man with a scarred face and cold eyes. "Been looking for you, old friend." Elias stepped in front of Mara, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip, toward the gun he'd stopped wearing months ago. Vic noticed and smiled. "Gone soft, I see. Heard you took up with some circus freak." His eyes flicked to Mara. "Christ, the rumors didn't do her justice. That's a lot of woman, Boone." "Leave her out of this," Elias said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between you and me." "See, that's where you're wrong." Vic dismounted, his companions following suit. "You made it about more than just you when you killed my brother, when you took someone I loved. Fair's fair, don't you think?" The street had cleared, people retreating into buildings. Sheriff Pruitt was out of town, wouldn't be back until tomorrow. It was just Elias, unarmed, and 3 men with guns. "I'll give you what you want," Elias said. "Just let her walk away." "Elias, no?" Mara's hand gripped his shoulder. "Please," he said, turning to look at her one last time. "I love you. I need you to be safe." Vic laughed. "Ain't that sweet? But see, I don't think I'm going to give you that mercy. I think your giant bride here gets to watch what happens when you cross Vic Keller." He drew his gun. Everything happened at once. Elias lunged forward, knowing he was too far away, knowing he was too slow. Vic's finger tightened on the trigger, and then Mara moved. She was faster than anyone would have believed possible for someone her size. She swept Elias aside with one arm while simultaneously grabbing a water trough with the other, a trough that held 100 gallons of water and weighed over 800 pounds. She lifted it like it was made of paper and hurled it at Vic and his men. The trough caught them full force, knocking all 3 off their feet in an explosion of water and splintered wood. Guns flew from their hands, skittering across the muddy street. But Vic was quick. He rolled, came up with a knife, and before Elias could shout a warning, he'd buried it in Mara's shoulder. Mara cried out, stumbling back. Elias roared, tackling Vic to the ground. They rolled in the mud, fists flying. Elias fought with a desperation born of love and loss, but Vic was younger, meaner, and winning. Through the blood in his eyes, Elias saw one of Vic's companions retrieving his gun, saw him aim it at Elias's head. Then Mara was there again, knife still protruding from her shoulder, blood streaming down her arm. She grabbed the gunman's wrist and twisted. The snap of breaking bone was audible across the street. The man screamed, dropped the gun. The 3rd man tried to run. Mara's fist caught him in the chest, and he went down hard, gasping for air. Vic, seeing his men incapacitated, tried one last, desperate attack. He pulled a 2nd knife from his boot, lunged at Elias's exposed back. Mara's hand closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground one-handed. Vic struggled, kicked, but her grip was iron. "You threatened the man I love," she said, her voice low and dangerous in a way Elias had never heard. "You came to my town, my home, and brought violence. Give me one reason I shouldn't end you right here." Vic's face was turning purple. His eyes bulged with terror. "Mara," Elias said softly, pulling himself to his feet. "Don't. He's not worth it." She looked at him, and he saw the struggle in her eyes, the rage warring with her gentle nature. Finally, she threw Vic down hard enough to knock the wind from him. "Sheriff Pruitt returns tomorrow," she said coldly. "You'll be in his jail cell when he does, all 3 of you." By then, people had emerged from buildings. Dr. Hayes rushed forward to tend to Mara's wound. Father McCready and several other men helped secure Vic and his companions. Elias rushed to Mara's side as the doctor examined her shoulder. The knife had gone deep, missing the bone by inches. "You stupid, brave, wonderful woman," Elias said, his hand shaking as he held her uninjured hand. "You could have been killed." She smiled weakly, face pale from blood loss. "It's not big that much," she said, echoing her words from that day with the roof beam. "Just needed 2 hearts instead of 1. Dr. Hayes worked quickly, removing the knife and stitching the wound. Mara bore it stoically, only wincing when Elias squeezed her hand too hard in sympathy. When it was over, when Vic and his men were secured in the makeshift holding cell in the church basement, when the street had been cleaned and order restored, Elias and Mara sat on the steps of her barn, watching the stars emerge. "I thought I was going to lose you," Elias said, his voice breaking, "when I saw that knife." "But you didn't," Mara interrupted gently. "I'm here. We're both here." "You saved my life again. You keep saving me, Mara, in every way a person can be saved." She leaned her head carefully against his shoulder, a movement that should have been awkward given their size difference, but somehow worked. "You saved me first," she said softly. "The day you saw me in that market, really saw me, you saved me from believing I'd always be alone." Elias reached into his pocket, pulled out the ring box. His hands were still shaking, covered in dried blood and dirt, but he opened it anyway. "I had a whole speech prepared," he said, "about how you're my home, my strength, my everything, but I think today proved that better than words ever could." He took her hand, slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Marry me, Mara Weller. Not someday, but soon. Tomorrow, if the preacher's willing. I've wasted too much time running from life. I want to run toward it now, with you." Tears streamed down her face, glinting silver in the starlight. "Yes," she whispered. "Tomorrow, next week, whenever. The answer will always be yes." They sat together as the night deepened around them, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds, who had proven that love was measured not in inches or pounds, but in courage, in choosing each other, in being willing to fight for that choice. And if Elias was smaller in stature and Mara was larger than life, it didn't matter, because together they were exactly the right size. Sheriff Pruitt returned the next morning to find Vic Keller and his gang trussed up like turkeys, nursing broken bones and bruised egos. After hearing the full story from a dozen witnesses, he wired the federal marshal's office. Turned out Vic had outstanding warrants in 3 territories. He and his men would hang or spend the rest of their lives in territorial prison. "You did good work," Pruitt told Mara, who sat with her arm in a sling. "Town owes you a debt." "The town owes me nothing," Mara said quietly. "I was protecting what's mine." The sheriff's eyes crinkled. "That's how I figure it, too." Father McCready proved willing to perform the ceremony that very Sunday. News spread through Dust Vale like wildfire. Some people disapproved, of course, but most were curious enough to attend. The church filled to capacity, people spilling out into the street. Mara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her frame. Even modified, it was simple. White cotton with lace at the collar, nothing fancy. But when she walked down the aisle, towering over every person there, she was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever seen. He stood at the altar in his best clothes, a pressed shirt and jacket he'd bought special for the occasion, his hair slicked back. Boots shined. His hands trembled as she approached, and he had to crane his neck to meet her eyes. "You're shaking," she whispered, a smile playing at her lips. "Terrified," he admitted. "Afraid I'll wake up and this will all be a dream." Father McCready cleared his throat, began the ceremony. The words were traditional, ancient, spoken over countless couples throughout history. But when Elias said, "I do," he meant it with every fiber of his being. And when Mara repeated the words, her voice strong and clear, he felt something inside him finally heal, some broken piece clicking back into place. "You may kiss your bride," Father McCready said with a smile. Mara knelt down. Elias stretched up, and when their lips met, the church erupted in applause. Genuine, warm, celebratory. That night, they held a modest celebration in the barn. Townsfolk brought food, music, even gifts. Practical things mostly, tools and supplies for their life together. Mrs. Henshaw gave them a beautiful quilt she'd sewn herself. Dr. Hayes presented them with a medical kit. Even Buck Morrison, nursing a black eye courtesy of Sheriff Pruitt's accidental elbow, managed a grudging nod of acknowledgment. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Elias and Mara stood together at the barn entrance, waving goodbye. "So," Mara said, "where do we go from here?" Elias had been thinking about this. The cabin he'd repaired was too small for them both. Mara couldn't even stand up straight inside. The barn was functional, but not comfortable for two people long term. "I have an idea," he said, "but it's going to take work, a lot of work." Over the following months, they built something new. Not a cabin, not a barn, but a proper house, one designed specifically for them. High ceilings to accommodate Mara's height, wide doorways, a large kitchen where they could cook together, a workshop for Mara's carpentry, a stable for the horses they were beginning to raise. They built it on the hill overlooking Dust Vale, the highest point on Mara's property. It was back-breaking work, but they tackled it together just as they'd tackled everything. Elias handled the detailed work, joinery, windows, the intricate roof design. Mara provided the muscle, lifting beams and stones that would have required multiple men. The house rose slowly through winter and into spring. Other people from town came to help. Young couples looking to learn construction, older folks who remembered Mara's parents fondly, even some of Buck's former friends who seemed genuinely sorry for their past behavior. By summer, 1 year after Elias had first ridden into Dust Vale, the house was complete. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, beautiful in its simplicity. Large windows faced west to capture the sunset. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, perfect for watching storms roll in. Inside, there were comfortable spaces and practical ones, rooms for living and rooms for working. On the night they moved in, Elias and Mara stood on their porch, watching the town lights flicker on below as darkness fell. "Happy?" Elias asked, his arm around her waist, or as far around as he could reach. "More than I ever thought possible," Mara said. "You know, I used to stand in my barn and look out at the stars and feel so small. Despite my size, I felt small, invisible, like I was taking up space I hadn't earned. And now," she smiled, turning to face him, "now I feel just right. Not too big, not too small, just Mara. Because you see all of me, not the size, not the strength, but the person underneath." Elias kissed her hand, the ring on her finger catching starlight. "You're the one who saved me, remember? I was drowning in my own grief, running from ghosts. You gave me a reason to stop." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. They stood together as the night deepened, and Elias pulled out something he'd kept hidden, his harmonica, the one he hadn't touched since Catherine died. He played a soft melody, one his mother had taught him as a child, a song about home and belonging. Mara began to sing, her voice low and melodic, making up words to fit his tune. On a hill where the wind blows free, two hearts found their destiny, one so tall and one so small. Together they stand, together they fall. Her voice carried across the hillside, and down in Dust Vale, people paused in their evening routines to listen. The lonely cowboy and his giant bride making music under the stars. 20 years passed. The house on the hill became a landmark. Travelers asked about it. Children told stories about the giant lady and her tiny husband. Though Elias was actually average height, everyone just seemed small next to Mara. Elias and Mara built a life that defied every expectation. They raised horses, sold honey, and Mara's carpentry became renowned throughout the territory. She could build anything: furniture, houses, entire barns. Elias managed their growing business, gentling the horses and handling the books. They never had children of their own. Mara's condition made it impossible, but they became surrogate parents to half the troubled kids in Dust Vale. Young people who felt different, outcast, too big or too small or too strange for the world's narrow definitions, found their way to the house on the hill, where a woman who understood what it meant to not fit in would listen, and a man who'd learned the value of stopping would offer wisdom. Sheriff Pruitt retired and was replaced by a woman, scandalous at the time, but Mara and Elias were the first to support her appointment. Dr. Hayes trained an apprentice who eventually took over his practice. Father McCready was replaced by a younger priest who was initially shocked by Mara's size, but quickly learned to appreciate her kindness. Buck Morrison eventually apologized, genuinely, tearfully, after his own daughter was born different, with a clubfoot that made her the target of cruel jokes. Mara was the one who taught the girl that different didn't mean less, that strength came in many forms. As years accumulated, Elias's hair turned fully white, his back developed a permanent stoop from years of labor, but his eyes still lit up every time Mara entered a room. Mara developed arthritis in her knees, the price of carrying so much weight, but her smile remained as bright as that first day in the marketplace. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, Elias playing his harmonica, Mara humming along, and watch the sun set over Dust Vale. Sometimes younger folks would visit, asking advice about love or life, or how to build a house that wouldn't collapse in the first strong wind. The secret, Mara would say, is finding the right partner. Someone who sees the person you are, not the person everyone expects you to be. And compromise, Elias would add with a wink. I wanted a 2-bedroom house. She insisted on 4. We built 6. They'd laugh, that comfortable laughter of people who'd weathered storms together, who'd built something lasting from nothing, who'd proven that love didn't care about size or propriety or what other people thought was proper. On their 20th anniversary, the town threw them a celebration. People came from neighboring territories, former students and customers, friends, old and new. They danced in the street, Elias and Mara swaying together despite their size difference, moving with practiced ease born of 2 decades of partnership. Later, after everyone had gone home, they sat on their porch again. Do you ever regret it? Mara asked quietly. Staying here, marrying me, building this life? Elias looked at her. This woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved, who had shown him that running from pain only brought more pain, that the biggest strength was the courage to stay. "Every day I wake up next to you," he said, "I thank whatever God is listening that my saddle broke that day, that the storm brought me to your barn, that I was foolish enough to buy honey I didn't need." "It wasn't foolish," she said softly. "It was brave." "Maybe, but you know what took even more bravery?" "What?" He smiled. "Accepting that I deserved to be happy again, that I was allowed to stop punishing myself. You taught me that, Mara. You taught me that it's okay to be scared of the future as long as you don't let that fear keep you from living." She kissed the top of his head, still had to bend down even after all these years. "And you taught me that I wasn't too much, that I was exactly enough." They sat together as stars emerged one by one, diamond bright in the desert sky. And if travelers passed by that night and saw the lights burning in the house on the hill, if they heard music drifting down, a harmonica and a woman's low melodic voice, they might have stopped to listen. They might have heard a story in that music, about a lonely cowboy who thought love was behind him, about a woman who'd spent her life being told she was too different to deserve happiness, about how they found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from their broken pieces. And if those travelers looked closely, they might have seen shadows on the porch, one tall, one shorter, moving together in perfect harmony. They might have smiled and thought how strange and wonderful the world was, that such different people could fit together so perfectly. But Elias and Mara would have told them there was nothing strange about it at all. That love was never about being the same size or the same shape or fitting into anyone's expectations. Love was about finding someone who saw you, truly saw you, and choosing to stay. Choosing to build something together even when the beams seemed too heavy and the future uncertain. Choosing to believe that together you were exactly the right size. "It's not big that much," Mara had said that first time, "covered in sawdust and sunlight. Just needs two hearts instead of one." And she'd been right.